Turning now to an important development in the news, and I want to begin like this. Let's just be real. It's a bad sign for American democracy when Washington or whatever thinks it's now a big deal that an official says the bare minimum facts. I'm talking about all the kerfuffle of Mike Pence, who recently noted that Trump was wrong to push Vice President Pence at the time to help overthrow the election or join what was a sloppy coup attempt. Words matter. And in this instance, the word wrong operates in both senses. Wrong, Pence says, because abusing power in a coup is unethical, and wrong in the narrower sense of just inaccurate, because the vice president does not have legal authority to magically overthrow elections, and you don't really need to go to law school to know that. Now, Pence's recent statement also stands out because it is so rare among Trump administration veterans or allies. Pence spent about 5 years backing everything Trump did, literally, and shredding his own claimed ideology of Christian conservatism, among other things. But there's more to it than all that. Pence's path here is instructive because it tracks with so many other Trump vets. And while some are now welcoming Pence for meeting this very low bar, a reasonable examination of the evidence merits being more careful here. Because while Pence's path was late, humiliating, and self-sabotaging, his time with Trump napalmed his own credibility and, as we've seen, his own potential future in the GOP for national office. And in that way, he's actually right now following the very path where Trumpians spend most of their tenure exchanging their own credibility for the power and perks of that Trump access. And then if they break, those who claim to break tend to do so under duress and still for their own self-interest. We all remember Charlottesville. There were Trump aides who saw Trump's defense of the anti-Semites and white supremacists who marched there as so extreme that there was pressure to speak out at the time and resign. Take Trump aide Gary Cohn, who claimed he was so serious about doing that inside the administration, he wrote a resignation letter. But he didn't use it. He stayed on after Charlottesville, hoping, according to reporting, that he might get even more power by running the Federal Reserve. Now, that aide claimed a well-timed objection while also staying on board. It's the same pattern of John Bolton, loyal to Trump in office, and then, when he had other interests in mind, claiming to speak out, positioning it as some sort of need to put the truth out there when he had to sell a book. And yet the very national security concerns that he claimed to have were the ones he refused to even testify about towards government investigations and the impeachment. That's actually a contradiction that I pressed him about in an interview. And for the record, Bolton had no rational explanation for why he hid that very important information about Trump that he claims was of vital public interest, but only on his pecuniary book schedule. Or take Bill Barr, who protected Trump at all costs, but also managed to leave the administration just a tad early, right before January 6th. We now know that was after he sat in meetings that showed Trump was on a war path that Counselor Barr knew could create criminal liability for anyone nearby. So Barr made a point of pretending to have his own break with Trump over those very issues that touched on his own self-interest or criminal liability and exposure, and he won praise from guess who? John Bolton, for doing the right thing and standing up to Trump at that moment. You really can't make it up. Maybe Bolton recognized the move because he had done it. Now, this all matters right now as the history is written, as the post-government jobs are worked out, as the prestige is accommodated, as the narrators tell the stories, and as we covered earlier in the broadcast, as the Republican Party decides what to do about the people who are for and with Trump ride or die, or were with Trump ride or die until they rode their way to other goals. Because as a nation, it does matter, I promise you. It still does matter when we decide who actually did the right thing. Now, yeah, we do live in a time of political hyperbole and willful fantasy, but that makes it all the more important to actually keep your eye on the facts. And remember that words matter. Their meaning matters. Our ability to communicate accurately matters. So none of those examples from Pence to Barr show actual political courage. I repeat, whatever you've heard and whatever headlines you've read and whatever's said on Twitter sometimes, the hot takes, if you actually use the original definition, those were not politically courageous acts. For that, you have to go to the origin of the concept, where a person in public life actually risks something, a big job or losing an election that might be won by simply selling out their values and hoping people don't notice and moving on in power. And then they knowingly take the risk for some greater good. That's political courage. It's a term commonly associated with JFK and one that a later president also discussed.
All great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage.
Our politics remains filled with division and discord, and everywhere we see the risk of falling into the refuge of tribe and clan. At such moments, it's necessary for us to show courage in challenging the status quo and in fighting the good fight.
Fair. Now, in contrast to some of those Trump-era examples that I just mentioned in this current Pence talk, there are real examples of political courage, and they're across the political spectrum. Take John McCain, who stood up on behalf of principles that also may have benefited his opponent, then Senator Obama, even though, as you see, at the time, McCain was losing to Obama.
We're scared of an Obama presidency.
He is a decent person and a person that you do not have to be scared.
He's not. He's an Arab. He is not. No.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about.
That was the height of the closing general election, October. What he said was not only right and correct in both senses, it also came with a cost that a politician like McCain knew all too well. He was right there in public, passing up on the energy and the turnout of bigoted voting blocs that America's seen all too well. Take another Republican, Bob Inglis, willing to do a rare thing in politics, change his mind when the facts became clear. He went from a climate denier to ultimately backing a carbon tax, a shift that he's candid about.
For the first 6 years I was in Congress, I said that climate change was nonsense. All I knew was Al Gore was for it. And that was the end of the inquiry, you know, because I represented a very red district in South Carolina.
Pretty candid, and after changing his positions, he did lose his seat in Congress. One person opposing him likening his work on science to Satanism. Now, it's not about which party you're in. One more recent nonpartisan example. Colonel Vindman, who blew the whistle on Trump's effort to get Ukraine to try to kneecap the Bidens.
I also recognize that my simple act of appearing here today would not be tolerated in many places around the world. In Russia, my act of expressing concern to the chain of command in an official and private channel would have severe personal and professional repercussions, and offering public testimony involving the president would surely cost me my life.
That was striking because of his experience and his family's experience in other parts of the world with autocratic governments. He has his life, but Vindman also had to determine that he needed to leave public service because of the whistleblowing. He retired from the Army. He's faced a lot of blowback. Those real examples, some by Republicans, some recent, put Mike Pence's tardy, well-timed break for his own interests in context. A year later, he's now found the ability to deem the coup attempt un-American. 13 months late. So what happened during this interim time? Well, by all accounts, Pence was still trying to figure out if there was any road back within the MAGA crowd that was so angry with him last January. He is taking this newer public stance, which has some potential benefits for the same reason the other people did, as I told you, after it's clear how much the base is hardened against him. 9 out of 10 Republicans oppose him running next cycle. And while this may have people focused on this new thing Pence said, this news cycle, those examples show, including some Republicans, that the measure of political courage is on your actions and your full record. And by that standard, if you deal in facts, let's not forget the facts of Pence's years of hypocrisy on behalf of Trump and awkward posturing that would put most rookie yogis to shame.
President Trump knows that the principle of one person, one vote is foundational to the American system of democracy.
You've restored American credibility on the world stage.
Many in the media have spent an awful lot of time focusing on what the president said and criticisms of what the president said, instead of criticizing those who brought that hatred and violence. A leader who I can tell you has been delivering every day on his promise to protect faith and restore freedom across this country.
Pence did all that supporting of Trump only to find it didn't even achieve perhaps the narrow political goal of even medium-level popularity in the party. It didn't work. It was bad for many reasons, as I've emphasized, but even politically it didn't work. Pence learned something that goes back as far as, well, a phrase from Thomas Jefferson. Mike Pence, congratulations. You played yourself.
Woo, you about to catch them flames, Daddy.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
Hit me with the button.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
That's actually Ebro, not Jefferson, but it does apply. And Pence did more than play himself, be that politically and shredding his credibility. He also lived out a lesson that is far more serious than that light-hearted phrase. It's a lesson as old as any kingdom or authoritarian system. If you discard all your principles for mere power and hunt with the wild wolves, it doesn't matter how many days you feed them, Mr. Pence. The first day you fail to feed them what they demand, they will try to kill you and eat you. The Trump fans were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." The Trump fans erected the machinery to do it. People died that day. Mr. Pence knew then, and must have known beforehand, based on his time in that system and among that community, if you want to call it that, exactly how serious they were, just as he knew it for the last 13 months. Think about what he knew and what he was willing to do over those 13 months until he has finally adopted the non-courageous stance of the self-interested pseudo-break, a Trumpian move for our times. He only acted when he felt he had nothing else to lose. We're going to get into this with Sheikh Omenduri when we're back in 60 seconds. Now we turn to our deep dive conversation, which is a special day here on The Beat. It is known as Che Day. The cartoon and the man you see on your screen, Sheikh Omenduri's worked on 3 campaigns for president, including Obama's, and we're indebted to him for some of the history we just recounted. Welcome back.
Good to be back, Ari.
This matters because how the history is written will matter, and this shapes where we're headed at a time of tremendous stress on our democracy. Walk us through your views on the difference between these attempts to seize the claim of political courage and true courage.
Well, I would argue that political courage has a very simple definition. It is following your conscience to do the right thing, even if it means losing an election. And that, I think, is the real definition of political courage. Now, I think people who are not in politics may say, well, you know, losing an election doesn't sound like a big deal. People have professional setbacks all the time. A lot of elected officials are well-educated, well-connected. They can land on their feet. What's the big deal with that? But trust me, in politics, all that matters is winning and losing elections for many and if not most politicians. Nobody other than Lindsey Graham said that most members would sell their own mothers to be elected or reelected. And that was a great look not only into the psyche of other elected officials, but also of Lindsey Graham. And if you look at Mike Pence with his supposed courage with those comments he made at the Federal Society, he risked nothing, absolutely nothing. He basically repeated comments he more or less has made over the last year as he's watched his presidential campaign flounder. And I think part of the pointedness of those comments was some anger at the reality that he realizes he will no longer be sitting in the Oval Office in 2025. That dream is dead. So what he has been doing instead is being very defensive. He has not in any way said that Trump has lied about winning the election. All he's done is try to tell the MAGA base over and over again since January 6th that, you know, I couldn't help you too much on your coup because my hands were tied legally. It was defensiveness on his part to try to keep the dream of election to the presidency alive for Mike Pence.
You say his hands were tied legally, as that's part of his way of deflecting the idea that he was disloyal to the coup they requested. Some of them wanted to tie his hands literally, and there were zip ties there, and there are people indicted for sedition conspiracy there, and there were people who perpetuated violence against police officers there. Do you think Mike Pence understands that it's not just a base that doesn't want him in power, but a base that in part wants him dead?
He may understand that, but he doesn't feel that. What he feels emotionally is the desire to be the Republican nominee in 2024. You know, David Hume famously said that reason follows the passions. Mike Pence's passion is to be the president in 2024. He then justifies it with different reasons, and he discards evidence, including the fact that Donald Trump thought it was perfectly okay to send a mob to possibly kill him. You know, you would think that would be a break point for a lot of politicians.
Yes,
it isn't. It wasn't for him.
Yes.
Yeah,
well,
it wasn't for him.
That's a great quote. That was a great quote, Jay, because it speaks to the way people do reason in these political circumstances. In just the first weeks after the insurrection, there was a swing away from it by many Republican elites. McConnell, who we covered earlier, and others were initially quite critical. And you said something on the program that I will fully admit to viewers. At the time, I wondered whether it was too far. And you were proven right. So this was, at the time, sounded pretty like severe criticism. Now it's become completely mainline. And so we pulled it for that reason of comparison. This was, I just want to tell viewers, January 18th, fresh off the insurrection. This is what you said.
Roughly half of all Republicans support in some form or other those riots. The Republican Party is largely now riot adjacent. 70 to 80% of Republicans still support Donald Trump despite everything that's happened.
What was it that you saw then that allowed you to go farther than conventional wisdom, and now with an RNC literally voting to not only defend those riots, as you put it, riot adjacent, but to really lie about them and embrace them as, quote, legitimate political speech, when the deadliest attack on the Capitol in 200 years would be the apex opposite of legitimate, lawful speech?
Well, what I saw was it wasn't a break point for a lot of MAGA fans and for the Trump base. So McConnell, a lot of Republicans, they sort of began to distance themselves from Trump. People were like, oh, Trump is over. You might remember Lindsey Graham, of all people, sat on the night of January 6th, said, I'm out of here. You know, this was too far for me. Well, then, you know, just a few weeks ago, he was like, well, Mitch McConnell shouldn't be the Senate leader if he's not down with Trump 2024. I mean, that is how much he has gone in 1 year. The reality was that a lot of the MAGA fans, the GOP base, basically saw that riot and they felt it was justified. So when the RNC said this was legitimate political discourse, they weren't lying from their point of view. From their point of view, this was legitimate political discourse. I think there's a deeper question as to how we got to a point where a base of an entire party, one of the two major parties in the United States, actually believes something like this, and how dangerous it is for our democracy that that's the case. But that is certainly the case. And I think Mike Pence largely proves it, because all he has done in the year since is try to make sure that base likes him as much as absolutely possible.
Yeah. No, it is. It's really striking. We need to pay attention to it. I think managing the facts and the boundaries does matter, in the same way that many of those efforts that we're still reporting on as failed and thwarted coups, not things that actually triumph. But as the founders even said, democracy is up to all of us to maintain. It doesn't just survive on its own. As I told viewers, Some of the reporting that we had, some of the historical examples were from you, and I thought were quite striking. So thank you for those and your thoughts. Always good to see you, Che.
Good to see you, Ari.
Absolutely. When we come back, we turn to a whole